Hi, everyone. Welcome back. This week, excuse me, we're going to move on to another chapter. So this week, we're going to move on to chapter 9, and we're going to talk about the last police procedure. So we spent this whole year talking about police procedures. This is the last police procedure we're going to talk about, which is pretrial identifications. So pretrial identifications can be broken down into two things. You're going to talk about eyewitness identifications and forensic identifications. We'll start this week talking about eyewitness identifications, and then we'll move on and talk about forensic identifications for the second part of the week. So that's what we're going to cover today. So let me get my video. So once you're done with this also, you are now ready to take your exam number 3. So exam number 3 is stop, question, frisk, arrest, interrogation, pretrial identification. And that will be the end. And then after, we'll start moving on to courtroom procedures. And we'll spend the rest of the semester talking about, courtroom procedures. Okay? So we are going to move on, and we're going to talk about these identification procedures. That's what we're going to talk about for this lecture for this week. Okay? So we're going to start with the idea of how do police figure out who the suspects are. So when you have a police officer shows up at a crime scene and investigates the crime and starts putting things together, how does the police start narrowing down who the suspects are? What specifically do they look at? Who do they talk to? Like, how do they narrow it down to figure out who is the suspect? Well, they look at two different things a lot of times. Number one, they talk to eyewitnesses and do interviews like we talked about in the last lectures, and they get information. And from that, they may be able to get what's called an eyewitness identification, where one of the witnesses can actually identify visually who the suspect is. Another way that they can get information or start narrowing down the suspect is through forensic science. So if they have forensic evidence that was left at the crime scene, hair, fiber, fingerprints, DNA, blood, anything like that, then they can use forensic science to also help narrow down who the possible suspects are. So we're going to start this week in this lecture, talking about eyewitness identifications. So the first thing we need to talk about is, what are eyewitness identifications? What am I talking about when I mean eyewitness identifications? So eyewitness identifications are when a witness can actually identify who the suspect is. So these are usually witnesses that are present while the crime was committed, and they can actually identify who they think the suspect is to the police. Now, when you talk about eyewitness identifications, you have to talk about memory, because they're identifying the suspect based on something they saw and that they are trying to remember. So when you talk about memory and identifications, you have to understand the 3 stages to memory, okay? So memory is not a video camera. We like to think of memory as, oh, it's like a video camera and we videotape it and we just replay it in our mind. But it doesn't quite work that way. You have 3 stages. So the first stage is when the eyewitness actually sees the event occurring, and they're taking what they see and they're putting it in their brain, okay? So there can be issues with that process of what you see and what you put in your brain that we'll talk about. Then you could have issues with storage. Storage is how well do you retain the information? So once you see it, you're not going to immediately say what you see. So it might be a little bit of time before you actually conduct the identification for the police. So that information has to be stored in your brain for a while. So that is also a time where certain things could be gone and it's not a video camera anymore. And then the last thing is we need to retrieve that information. We need to go into our brain and pull it back out, and that's retrieval. So all memories have these 3 steps: the encoding, seeing it, the storage, and the retrieval. Now, when you're encoding it, there can be certain things that affect the encoding process. So you may not actually even see everything or encode everything that you think you see. So I want to show you a little video real quick and have you tell me what you think of what you see. So I'm sorry, I should have opened it ahead of time and I forgot. So let me get to it. I knew that they were here and I put them online. You can also watch them online. So all the videos I'm going to reference today are online. If you go to the lecture and course materials, it says videos from lecture. You can find a link to all of the videos that we're going to talk about in this class, because there's a lot of little videos that I'm going to show you. Okay. So here it is. So I opened it. Okay, let me share it now with you. Okay.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
Why, I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
But how did you know?
Madam, as any horticulturist will tell you, one does not plant petunias until May is out. Take her away.
Sorry, madam.
It's just a matter of observation. The real question is, how observant were you?
Action.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
Why, I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
Okay, so the reason why I wanted to show you that is because when you are encoding information, there are times when everything doesn't get encoded. Sometimes you don't see certain things. And if your mind is not paying attention to those certain things, then you're not encoding that information into your brain. So we rely on eyewitness identifications for a lot of things, but we have to remember it's not a video camera. Everything that we actually are seeing is not actually getting encoded in our brain. Only things that we're actually concentrating on or looking or paying attention to. So if there's a lot of other things that are going on around the person, they may not even see those things. And so those ideas or concepts or visions are not actually ever going to be encoded in the brain. Okay, so let's talk about storage. Storage can also be a problem. There's been a lot of research on memory, and they've come up with what's called the forgetting curve. And we know that once somebody knows something, so this is what they know initially, within 20 minutes, we've already lost 40% of what we know. Within an hour, we're down to 50% of what we've lost. Or we're down to 60%, so we lost 40, then we're down to 50, and then within 9 hours, we're down to 30. And the idea is initially we remember, but it drops very quickly, but then it kind of levels off, and we only really maintain about 30% of what we encode in our brain. So that can be another problem with eyewitness identifications, because it's not all being stored the way we think it's going to be stored in the brain, okay? And then the last thing we have to think about is retrieval. Retrieval is when we're trying to dig out what we did, in code in our brain and that we did store. We need to retrieve that and kind of pull it out. If you ever watched Harry Potter, he pulls the memories out into the pensive and he puts it in the pensive. Well, we don't really have that in real life. There is no such thing as a pensive. We can't pull these memories out and have them be exactly a video camera of what we saw. But so when we pull them out, there can be errors from that also. We could be, the memories could have been altered when we're being pulled out. They can be suggestive, things like that. Now, when we're talking about retrieval in the court process, there's two different types of retrieval. You have out-of-court identifications. So this is prior to the trial actually starting. You could have the eyewitness go to the police station and actually pick out who they think the person is. And sometimes you have what is called in-court identifications. So that's when the witness is on the stand and identifies who the suspect is in the courtroom. So the attorneys would say, do you recognize the person that killed your family member in the courtroom? Yes, it's him. And then they point out the actual person. So those are the two types of eyewitness identifications that can occur. So first I want to talk about these out-of-court identifications. So these occur prior to trial, and this is during the investigation phase when the police are trying to gather evidence and get ready for court. So what happens is there are different methods that police can use to have a identification. So they can use lineups, show-ups, or photo arrays. So the first one is a lineup. So a lineup is when you get a group of people together that are similarly looking, height, weight, skin complexion, hair, clothes, and have them personally in person line up. And then you have the witness who is there, who can kind of look out and see who they think, which one they think it is. So they're all lined up in order, and you can kind of pick them out, which one that you think is it. A show up is different. A show up is only one person is brought to the witness identifying and says, is this the person? So a show up just literally narrows it down to one person, brings the person to the witness and asks the witness if it's this person. These are inherently suggestive, and these are the most suggestive and unreliable of all, because when we're doing that retrieving and storage, our memory can be sometimes corrupted. And when they only bring one person, it's very suggestive on our mind. And then we tend to just think, oh, yes, it's that one person. The last one is photo array. So a photo array is when they show you a series of photographs and you have to pick out which person you think it is in the photo array. Okay, so those are the different out-of-court identifications. Now, through a lot of research, they have shown that they're all very unreliable. Eyewitness identifications in general are pretty unreliable. We still use them though, and we still give them a lot of credence. The jury eats it up. They love it from a legal perspective. But from a scientific perspective, we've really shown that they're not very reliable types of things. Okay. So thinking about reliability, Freddie Freeloader is arrested for armed robbery. During the interrogation, he is asked to stand in a lineup. You are his attorney. So we know that they're unreliable. And we know that they're not great for if somebody just thinks it's on my client or he thinks my client looks like the person, then it could be really bad for our client because we know the jury's going to eat it up. So the question is, can the attorney refuse to have Freddie Freeloader stand in the lineup? So what constitutional challenges can we have to this pretrial eyewitness identification? How can we say it's unconstitutional and get it thrown out of court? So one of the arguments that has been made is that it's self-incrimination. So to force a person to stand in the lineup or have their picture be in the photo array is having them self-incriminate themselves. And the court, where we know from the Fifth Amendment, we have the right against self-incrimination. So if we're standing in the lineup, aren't we incriminating ourselves? So if Freddie Freeloader refuses to stand in the lineup, saying that it violates his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination if he stood in the lineup. So this went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, it's not. We're only going to say it's self-incrimination if it's actually testimonial, meaning words out of the person's mouth. So if you're forcing them to answer questions and actually communicate through verbal communication, that's self-incrimination. But we are not going to extend self-incrimination to forcing somebody to stand in a lineup. So this constitutional challenge would fail. Another challenge that also often comes up is that the defense will claim, well, they have the right to counsel. So you cannot conduct a lineup without counsel present. So at least the counsel could be there to make sure that nothing goes on during that identification process. So Freddie Freeloader agrees to stand in the lineup, but argues that his attorney must be there or it will violate his Sixth Amendment right to counsel. So his attorney needs to be in the room with the witness and watch this pretrial identification occurring. So what do you think? So why would you want this? Well, you want to make sure the police don't suggest, why don't you look at number one again? Maybe take a better look at number one. Are you sure it's not number one? Those things would be very suggestive. So you may want your attorney to be there to make sure that those things aren't said during the process. So this also went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided that you do have the right to counsel during the lineup, but only after you have been formally charged. So prior to be actually arrested and charged, if they ask you and you just stand in the lineup, you don't have the right to have your attorney there. But once you are formally charged with a crime, then the attorney must be present at the lineup or show up for identification. And if not, the identification is excluded. This has become known as the Wade-Gilmore rule. So we have to figure out where in the criminal justice process this identification procedure is occurring. If it's after formal charges, make sure that the defense attorney is there during the process. Now, Freddie Freeloader agrees to stand in the lineup, but he is the only male in the lineup with all females. What do we think about that? Well, hopefully you think it wouldn't be very fair. So when we talk about fair, we talked about due process, fair process. Do we think that this is a fair process? So we need to then talk about the 14th Amendment due process or fair process challenge. So can the attorney make a challenge and say this is unfair? It's not a fair process. So basically the Supreme Court has said, yes, that the process has to be fair. So when you are conducting pretrial identifications, you have to make sure as a police officer that the process that you're using is done in a fair way. That means that it's not suggestive. You're not hinting or suggesting or pointing out or doing anything to influence the witness. The witness has to decide who the person is out of their own free will with no influence from anybody else. So number one, cannot be suggestive. The second thing is we have to have some level of belief that this process is reliable. We don't want witnesses just guessing who they think it is. We want some reliability. We want to be able to trust what they said. So when we talk about pretrial identifications, we're really almost always looking at these two factors, reliability and suggestivity. These tend to be the main challenges that you see to the identification evidence being used at court. So if a witness makes an identification, then you're going to take that to court and say, jury, look, this witness identified this person. But we're only going to allow that person to testify to that at court if we can convince the judge that the identification process was reliable and not suggestive. Okay, now let's take a closer look at how memory really works to determine if eyewitnesses are inherently unreliable. So there is a video. I'm not going to show every video through here, but what I would like you to do is stop this video, go to the lecture videos that I posted under Blackboard and watch the one that's called Remembering and Forgetting. It's actually a psychology crash course because a lot of the stuff dealing with memory is actually a psychology types of concepts, but it focuses specifically on pretrial identification. So it talks about memory and how pretrial identifications can be very manipulated through this process. So take a few minutes to watch that and then come back to this and watch the rest of this after you've watched that video. Now, what about this? So is this a reliable witness? Margie accuses Archie of rape. She gave police a general description of the assailant: fat and flabby, smooth skin, bushy hair, youthful voice, between 16 and 18 years old, between 5'10" and 6 foot tall, weighing between 180 and 200 pounds, and having a dark complexion. Over 7 months, she viewed suspects in her home, the police station, in lineups and show-ups, and in 30 to 40 photographs. She stated one photo was similar, but couldn't ID the suspect. Several months later, police called her to the station to view a suspect detained on another charge. Police tried to gather a suitable lineup, couldn't find enough people to fit the suspect's physical description, so they conducted a show-up, so only one person. 2 detectives walked the suspect past the victim. The victim requested the suspect say, "Shut up or I'll kill you." The victim then said she had no doubt that was about her identification. So we have to ask ourselves, is this a reliable identification? Was she reliable? So what about this scenario would you say, yeah, I actually think she's pretty reliable? Well, maybe because her description is very, very detailed. Another thing could be that she did not falsely identify a lot of other people, right? She did lineups, she did show up, she looked at photographs, and she never just jumped on somebody and said it was that person. So another factor that could show reliability is the fact that she did not misidentify anybody else. And then when she did walk by the person, she said, "I think it's this person." And she didn't really waver, and she said she was very certain about it. So those were all factors of reliability. Now, why could it be unreliable? Well, because she never did really identify people. Maybe she is becoming a little desperate to find somebody. It's been over a month. We know what happens to memory every day that it goes on. And then the other thing is it was suggestive. It was a show up, and only one person was brought to her. So these are the types of things a court has to balance, these different factors. So if we were a judge, we would have to ultimately make the determination of whether or not we believe that she is actually reliable. If we don't find her reliable, we're not going to let her testify at court that she identified the suspect. We're only going to go on with the analysis if we actually find her reliable. Now, to help us with the assessment of whether somebody is reliable, a court case called Neal versus Biggers came about. And in Neal versus Biggers, the court created a test for judges to use to determine whether or not they believe that an eyewitness is reliable. And they identified it as the substantial likelihood of misidentification test. So is there a substantial likelihood that this eyewitness is misidentifying the person? So what are we going to look at to determine reliability? how long did the offender view, how long did the witness have to view the offender during the crime? So if it was a split-second crime, or was it a crime that took some time? And how much did this eyewitness get a chance to actually look at the offender during the crime? The next one, how much attention was the witness able to pay during the crime? So think about our whodunit video, right? In the whodunit video, there's so much going on and there's shifting the camera that you can't necessarily pay attention to everything that's going on. So if you don't have the ability to pay attention, or it's super stressful, or certain things are going on, you may not be able to pay attention. There's a lot of research. So a lot of people say, well, it was the worst day of my life. I will never forget it. And a lot of research actually shows it's the opposite. The more stressed you are, the more traumatized you're being because of what's happening, the less you actually do remember, because it deducts or it takes away from your ability to pay attention. Another factor they're going to look at is how accurate your prior description was and how does it fit the person you picked. So when you initially gave your description to the police officers, you listed what you think was the description. When you ultimately picked the person in the lineup, how closely matched were those descriptions? The level of certainty. So one of the things in the previous example, we said the police asked, how certain are you? And they said, I'm absolutely certain. So what you're going to see a lot of times with these kind of cases is after the eyewitness makes the identification, the police will say to the person, how certain are you? So they're going to use that level of certainty to help determine if we think that's credible. Now, whether a person believes that they are certain or not doesn't always mean accuracy. So a lot of research has gone into this, and certainty does not mean accuracy, but the court is still going to consider that as a factor. And then one of the last things they're going to look at is how much time did it take between the time that the crime occurred and the time the identification is actually occurring. So remember that forgetting curve. If it's a long period of time before the actual identification procedure is carried out, then it's going to be less reliable. There's going to be a higher likelihood of misidentification. So what the courts are going to do is they're going to look at all of these factors put together. They're going to use all of these different factors and make a determination on reliability. How reliable is the witness? These are going to be very important. So make sure you have them listed somewhere, because you need to use these factors on your case study and on your exam questions based on this issue. Okay. So a substantial likelihood of misidentification becomes a very important piece for the judges to determine on the reliability factor. Now, would these meet the bigger factors? You are eating your dinner one night at a park. You run to your car because you forgot a fork. As you are running back, you see a culprit eating your dinner. You stare the culprit in the eyes, but the culprit does not move. You can't believe it. Finally, the culprit moves away. You immediately call 911 and describe the culprit in great detail. About a week later, you are asked to identify the culprit in a lineup, which you do. Your description turns out to be very, very accurate, and you are very certain about your identification. So when we look at the reliability factor, so opportunity to view the offender, you looked the offender right in the eye. You were sure. You stared right at the offender, and the offender stared back at you. So you meet that. How much were you paying attention? Totally just focused on this culprit. All I was looking at. I wasn't looking at anything else. There was nothing else going on. High degree of attention. How accurate was my description? Spot on. What I described was exactly what the person looked like. I was very certain, and it was only about a week. So you would do an assessment of that, and you'd say, very, very reliable, right? So as a judge, you'd say, very reliable. But here's the question. This is our lineup, okay? So sometimes we can be really, really certain of something, but there could be another factor that would make the identification process bad and unconstitutional. And that would be whether or not our lineup itself, the procedures we use, the lineup to show up the photo array, if the procedures we used to conduct it were done in an unfair way, okay? So is this fair? Do you think if this is the lineup, this is fair? Well, of course not, right? Because they're not living things. So you have to not only determine if the witness is reliable, you also have to look at the procedures used by the police and make sure those procedures were fair. So what the Supreme Court has said in Foster v. California is that the Fourth Amendment is violated, fair due process is violated if the actual identification process used by the police leads to an inevitable identification, right? So this is a lineup that is inevitable. There's only one thing you can choose, right? So if the police set up an identification process, which is clearly going to lead the person to identify just one person, no matter what, that means that it's inevitable. Then the court has said that's going to be unfair, and it will violate the 14th Amendment against fair process or due process. So what ultimately then occurred is that both of these things were put together that we talked about, reliability and suggestivity. So there was a case called Manson versus Brathwaite. And in Manson versus Brathwaite, the court said, when determining whether to allow a witness to talk about an eyewitness identification, you have to meet both of these tests. So first, the judge has to assess whether the person is reliable. And they're going to use the substantial likelihood of misidentification factors. So that's the first part of the analysis, going through each of those factors and the judge making a determination of whether or not this witness is reliable. If you get past reliability, then you look at the procedures that are used by the actual court, police officers. If the procedures were unduly suggestive, were very likely to lead to one identification under the Foster test, then it's going to be thrown out. So even if the witness is reliable, if the procedures are suggestive, you cannot use the pretrial identification. So this has become known as the Brathwaite test, okay? The Manson versus Brathwaite, the pretrial identification test. So when you go to the rules section of your homework or on tests, you're going to cite Biggers, Foster, okay, I was downloading something and just kicked on. So when you are going through your case study, you're going to have to first make a determination, is the eyewitness reliable using those factors? And then you're going to look at the procedures and whether those procedures were unduly suggestive. One of the things you have to be very careful of was show-ups, one person being brought. They are inherently suggestive. They are very, very suggestive. So you have to be very careful if you're using that type of identification procedure. And that's why they usually only use that in extreme emergencies, because there's going to be a high probability that it is suggestive. Okay? Now, complete the analysis. So everything we just went through, let's talk about it, because this is how you're going to do your homework assignment. The victim is grabbed from behind at the doorway of her kitchen and raped. When the victim screams, her 12-year-old daughter came running out of the bedroom and also screams. The rapist tells the victim, "Tell your daughter to shut up or I'll kill you both." Over a 7-month period, the victim cannot be identified in a photo array, a lineup, or show-ups. Later, police have the victim return to the station and have the defendant say, "Shut up or I will kill you." The victim identifies the defendant as the rapist. So now as a judge, we have to determine, will we allow this victim to testify at court? So number one, is she reliable? So we're going to go through the factors. How much did they get to pay attention? So that could be problem. I don't know if I have them listed here. That could be problematic, right? Because she's being raped, her daughter's there. She's going to really be concentrating on her daughter being there. The other thing, and maybe not focusing so much on the offender. The other thing is, remember, he grabs her from behind. So the victim may never actually get a great look at the offender. The other factors we have to look at, how long. It was 7 months prior to being able to identify the person. So that's going to lead to more idea of possibly unreliable, right? So that's going to be one of the factors. So let's go back. What were some of the other factors? Opportunity to view the offender, so grab from behind, how much they're paying attention. She's probably paying attention to her daughter. I don't really give you a description, so I can't tell how certain. She was pretty certain because she didn't identify anybody before. And then the length of time we said was 7 months. So as a judge, you're going to weigh all those factors and you're going to have to make a determination. Do you think she's reliable? Now, maybe the fact that she didn't pick anybody out, like the earlier example, willy-nilly, makes you feel she's more reliable because she held out and she didn't really do any picking before that. So let's just say, for sake of argument, you can get past substantial likelihood of misidentification test. The court decides, yes, probably reliable enough. Then we have to look at the procedure that the court used. And in this case, the procedure the court used when the identification was made was a show up. Remember, show ups are inherently suggestive. So in this case, it would be very, very hard to get past suggestivity, because it's a show up and there was really no emergency or need to do it right at that time. So I think this might be a difficult pretrial identification to have. The judge is going to have a hard time allowing this witness to testify because you probably failed the breath weight test. Okay, so I have posted another video that you can look at. It's called Bomber on the Roof. So what you do is you play the little video and you watch the video of the bomber on the roof and you pay attention. After you watch the video, ask yourself, what is your likelihood of misidentification? What opportunity did you have to see the person? What degree of attention did you pay to what you needed to pay attention to? And you know what we're doing here, so you would think you'd pay attention a little more intently. Could you give a description of the person? How accurate was your description? What's the level of certainty that you are? And how long has it been? So it's a short period of time, okay? Once you have done that, then click on the video that has the suspects and it gives you a lineup. See if you can identify the person in the lineup, okay? So when you're looking at all of the people, try to figure out which one that you think it is. Ask yourself too, is that procedure suggestive? Are all of the people in the lineup dressed similar height, weight, physical features, hair, clothing? Are they all basically similar to each other? Courts have found if you have people wear one specific thing and nobody else is wearing it, that can be suggestive. Again, similar height, weight, color, things like that, you need to know, can be suggestive. So it's hard sometimes to get a lineup because you have to have them be so similar. So in your lineup, what do you think? Do you think it was a fair procedure? Okay. So one other thing I want to talk about is what other factors could lead to an incorrect pretrial identification? What other things can influence a witness into making a false identification? We talked about the 3 steps of memory. There can be errors in all 3 of those steps that can affect the pretrial identification. So number 1, when there's weapons involved or it's a highly stressful situation, we know that they're going to be encoding mistakes, just like the whodunit video. There's so much going on. We're so stressed. If there's a weapon, all we're thinking about is that weapon, and we're going to miss a lot of other things. So there can be errors in the encoding process. Storage, we know once it's stored there, if there's alcohol involved, if it's a super young person, if it takes a long time, that can affect our memory that's stored in our brain. And then retrieval mistakes. We could have what's called confirmation bias. Somebody tells us something and confirms that we're right, and then we just believe that we're certain. But it's not necessarily that we're certain. They're just confirming our already bias that we have. Also, the environment can be stressful, and it can be suggestive to us, and it can lead to bad retrieval mistakes, which can lead us to false identifications. So then there's a question, should convictions ever be based solely on these eyewitness identifications? We know there's all kinds of problems with these identifications. Should we ever have a conviction based on these eyewitness identifications by themselves? So this is a super cool video that I highly recommend. It's called Eyewitness Identification, Getting It Right. It's based on a man named Cotton and a woman who was raped. And she identifies Cotton as the man that raped her. And she talks about paying attention and trying to pick out the right person. But then she talks about how confirmation bias and certain things affected that memory. And ultimately, it turns out that Cotton did not rape her. The DNA proved later it wasn't. And so now her and Cotton go around the country and talk about the unreliability of these eyewitness identifications. So it's a short video. I mean, there's a whole big, huge documentary thing you can watch on it. This is just a short clip, but it's really, really interesting. It's called Picking Cotton. So it's really interesting to see that perspective. The last thing I want to talk about is, or one of the last things I want to talk about is cross-race identification. Now, before I get to this, I want to give you your word for this week's lecture. So this week's lecture, the word that you need to send me to show that you watched the video is going to be misidentification. Okay, so misidentification is your word for this lecture. Okay. Now, go back to cross-race identifications. I showed a little video. It's just a clip from a TV series that used to be on, and they show how cross-race identifications are. But basically, the concept is that a lot of research has gone in to show that people of one race often have a difficult time distinguishing the minute features of people from other races. So we're used to seeing our features from the people in our race, but then when we see people from other races, we tend to say things like, oh, everybody looks alike in that race, right? And that's because our brains have a hard time. We focus on the larger things that's different with the races, and we fail to look at the details of those things. And so we know particularly that cross-race identifications are even more unreliable than regular identifications. They're very, very difficult for people to make accurate cross-reference identifications. It's so bad that New York Court of Appeals, our highest court in New York, says that if a witness's identification of the defendant is at issue, so if you have an eyewitness identification and the defendant is challenging it, not wanting that witness to testify, and the defendant is from a different race, then you have to instruct the jury about this prior to their deliberation, that the jury should consider if there is a difference in race between the defendant and the witness who identified the defendant. And the jury must consider that people have a greater difficulty accurately identifying members of different race than their own race. And they have to decide whether a difference in race affected the accuracy of this witness's identification. So this is pretty significant in New York. If you're going to have a pretrial identification procedure and the witness is going to testify that they identified the witness, the jury is going to be instructed, if they're from different races, that could have affected the identification and the accuracy. So the jury's really going to have to weigh how reliable they actually think this witness is. Now, whether or not that has to occur at the federal level, it has not. It's not been decided. So that's a specific issue that's directed just towards New York at this point. Now, the last thing is, why do we care? Why are we even talking about reliability, subjectivity, these identifications? Why do we care? Well, it's one of the leading factors in false convictions. So there's all kinds of different procedures that can go wrong that can lead to a false conviction. We said interrogations are one of those processes. So very harsh, intense Reed method interrogations can lead to false confessions that lead to wrongful convictions. False identifications are the other main way people tend to end up being wrongfully convicted. So out of 100 people that were exonerated by DNA later, so out of the 100 people studied that they eventually said were wrongfully convicted, 98% of them had a faulty eyewitness testimony. So we know that these eyewitness identifications can be a significant factor in leading to a wrongful conviction. So hopefully you're working on your wrongful conviction paper. And one of the things you need to be doing is thinking about these procedures. And a lot of times you may have a false identification as part of your faulty procedure. So keep an eye out for that. So this just shows you the different things that lead to false convictions. And the first, number one, 77% was eyewitness misidentifications. So then we have faulty forensics, which we'll talk about in the next lecture. And then we have false confessions or admissions. And then we have snitches or informants turning information to get themselves a deal that wrongfully convicts someone else. So keep an eye out when you're working on your wrongful conviction stuff for all of these different factors. So we now know that there's a problem with identifications. What can we do about it? So there's a whole series of things that they recommend that you do to make sure that your identification procedures are done properly. And the FBI has done extensive research and has actually issued what's called the eyewitness identification process. So these are specific procedures that the police direct police departments to use, especially in photo arrays. So remember, a photo array is showing photographs. So photo arrays are still unreliable, but they're least unreliable of all. Does that make sense? So show-ups are the most unreliable. Lineups, not so good. But if you have to pick out of the three, photo arrays are the best because they're the least unreliable. But you have to conduct these photo arrays in a special way. And so these are some of the rules that the FBI has said to follow when using these photo arrays. So the first thing is they should be done what we call double blind. That means the person who is showing the witness the photographs does not know who the suspect is. So you want to ask somebody in your department who has nothing to do with the case, has no idea who the suspect is, to perform the photo array or show the pictures, because we want it to be double blind. We don't want any chance that that person could suggest who it is. The other thing that they suggest is what we call a sequential presentation. So instead of just laying 5 photos out in front of the person, show them one picture at a time. Is it this person? And then they have to decide yes or no. Is it this person? Yes or no. The reason is that there's been a lot of studies that when they have all the pictures there, they're going to try to narrow it down to the person that most looks like that person. So think back to the video you watched about the roof bomber, right? So you looked at the lineup, who did you think that it was? Did you pick somebody? Because it actually wasn't anybody in the lineup. Okay. So that is the problem. We try to narrow down who we think it is. And if we have everybody there, that's what we do. But it's not always true. So if we just show one at a time, then they can just say yes or no. Never use show-ups unless it's an absolute emergency, because they are going to be inherently suggestive. If you're doing a photo array or a lineup, the people should be the same sex, race, approximate age, personal characteristics, weight, height, hair color, skin color, and similar clothing. So we've talked about that. We can't use like one colored photograph and all black and white photographs. We can't tell, can't make any moves or anything that would make it suggest who somebody is. Can't point or lean or do anything like that. We want to make sure we tell the witness that it may be none of the people, so that they don't feel an obligation to pick at least one of the people. And then as soon as the identification is made, you ask how certain that they are before anything else can contaminate. And then do not either confirm or deny what they say. When they make an identification, you just say, okay, thank you. And that is it. Don't say good job. Don't say you picked the right person. So if you watched that picking cotton, that contributed to her consistently picking the wrong person, because they kept saying good job. So she thought she was picking the right person. And that's confirmation biased. Okay. So that's all pretrial identifications, but don't forget, we still have these in-court identifications. So the problem is, if you have a faulty out-of-court identification, can the person then take the stand and make the identification in court? And the answer is no, okay? So it's fruit of the poisonous bad prior identification. So once the identification process goes wrong, you can never really correct it, because that person's already in the witness's head, okay? So if they don't make a good pretrial identification, or the pretrial identification is declared suggestive or unreliable, you cannot allow that person then to make an in-court identification. So just as a review, now when you're doing your homework and you're looking over the case studies, you're going to look at use the breath weight test. So you're going to read the scenario and you're the judge. You have to first figure out what's the likelihood of misidentification. So use the Biggers factors and cite Biggers in your rule section. And then you have to combine it with the Foster analysis. So cite Foster and decide whether the procedures used by the police were unduly suggestive. So make sure in your rule section you cite Brathwaite, Biggers, Foster, and then in the analysis, make sure you go through each of these steps of this analysis. Okay, so that's all I have for pretrial identification based on witnesses. We'll move on and talk about forensic identifications in the next lecture. See you soon.